January 17, 1944. Dawn breaks across the volcanic ridges of Bougainville, and the jungle exhales its nightly moisture in thick gray columns that rise between the trees like smoke from 1,000 unseen fires. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 6th Division crouches in a forward observation post, his field glasses trained on the coastal perimeter below where American forces have carved an airfield from the swamp and stone. He watches the strange aircraft circle overhead, C-47 Skytrains, their twin engines growling through the humid air. Then the sky blooms with silk. Dozens, then hundreds of parachutes unfold against the pale morning light, white mushrooms descending toward the jungle floor. Tanaka lowers his field glasses and permits himself a thin smile. He has heard the reports from Burma and New Guinea. These American paratroopers, these so-called elite warriors who fall from the sky, they arrive scattered, disorganized, vulnerable in those precious minutes when their boots touch earth and their hands still fumble with harness releases. The men around him whisper and point. One soldier laughs, a sharp bark that echoes in the confined space. They have been told these Americans are soft, that they fight with machines because they lack the spirit for true combat. And now they rain down into the jungle like gifts, isolated and far from their supply lines, dropping into terrain the Japanese have held for months. Tanaka calculates distance and timing. 9 days, he thinks. Perhaps 10 before American reinforcements can fight their way through the perimeter. By then, these paratroopers will be ghosts in the jungle, or they will be dead. What Lieutenant Tanaka could not know, what the intelligence reports from Tokyo had failed to convey, was that descending through that humid air were men of the 82nd Airborne Division, soldiers who had been forged in the crucible of Sicily and hardened on the cliffs of Salerno, paratroopers who carried not just rifles and ammunition, but an entire philosophy of warfare that would unravel every assumption the Japanese High Command had made about American fighting spirit. The laughter in that observation post on January 17 would curdle into something else entirely before 9 days had passed. It would transform into a grudging, terrible respect born from the realization that these men falling from the sky represented something the Imperial Japanese Army had never encountered. An enemy who combined industrial abundance with democratic resilience, who could endure isolation not through blind obedience but through individual initiative, and who carried in their equipment bags and ammunition pouches a material superiority so profound it bordered on the incomprehensible. The origins of American airborne doctrine traced back to the late 1930s, when military observers watched German Fallschirmjäger operations with a mixture of fascination and concern. The United States had entered the concept late, establishing its first parachute test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia, in 1940, a mere 4 years before those men would descend into Bougainville's volcanic jungle. The 82nd Infantry Division, a storied unit that had fought in France during the Great War, was reorganized as an airborne division in August 1942. The men who filled its ranks came from every corner of America, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, and coal miners from Pennsylvania. What united them was a peculiar combination of physical courage and intellectual independence that the airborne selection process demanded. You volunteered for jump school. You chose to step out of a perfectly functioning aircraft at 1,200 feet. That choice, that fundamental act of individual will, would prove more significant than any Tokyo strategist could have imagined. The training was designed to be brutal. At Fort Benning, men ran 5 miles before breakfast, completed obstacle courses that left them scraped and bleeding, and endured weeks of physical conditioning that reduced their body fat to stringy muscle and leather-tough endurance. Then came the towers, learning to fall, learning to land, learning to control the parachute in descent. The washout rate exceeded 30%. Those who remained earned their jump wings and the extra $50 per month that came with hazardous duty. More importantly, they earned a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They were paratroopers. They were the best America had, and they knew it. This psychological edge, this esprit de corps fostered through shared hardship and selective admission, would prove as valuable as any weapon they carried. But the Japanese intelligence officers evaluating American military capability in 1943 and early 1944 saw only stereotypes confirmed through prejudice. The reports that circulated through Imperial General Headquarters painted American soldiers as mechanically dependent, spiritually weak, and physically soft, men who required hot meals and regular mail delivery to maintain morale, who collapsed without their vehicles and radios, who lacked the warrior spirit that centuries of samurai tradition had instilled in Japanese soldiers. These assessments were not entirely without foundation. American logistics were indeed extraordinarily dependent on supply chains. American soldiers did expect regular meals and mail from home. Where the Japanese analysis failed catastrophically was in confusing preference with capability, in mistaking the choice to fight with abundant resources for an inability to fight without them. The 82nd Airborne's deployment to the Pacific Theater in late 1943 represented a strategic gamble. The island-hopping campaign required speed and flexibility. Traditional amphibious assaults were proving costly in both time and casualties. Airborne operations offered the possibility of seizing key objectives rapidly, disrupting enemy defensive preparations, and creating chaos in rear areas. But the terrain was uniquely challenging. The European theater offered open fields and established landmarks. The Pacific jungle was a three-dimensional maze of vegetation so thick that officers standing 10 feet apart could barely see one another. Navigation became guesswork. Radio communications degraded in the humidity and dense foliage. The environmental conditions alone would test these paratroopers in ways their European combat experience had not prepared them for. When the transport planes lifted off from their staging base on January 16, each paratrooper carried approximately 85 pounds of equipment strapped to his body and secured in his gear bags. The standard combat load included an M1 Garand rifle or Thompson submachine gun, 200 rounds of ammunition, 4 fragmentation grenades, 2 smoke grenades, a combat knife, entrenching tool, first aid kit, water canteen, and 3 days of K-rations. Officers carried additional maps, compasses, and signal equipment. Sergeants hauled extra machine gun ammunition. Every man carried morphine syrettes, salt tablets, and water purification tablets. The weight made movement on the ground exhausting, but it represented something more significant than mere logistics. It embodied American abundance. Where Japanese infantry often operated on reduced rations and limited ammunition supplies, these paratroopers hit the ground with enough material to sustain independent operations. They were self-contained combat units, each squad essentially a mobile fortress of firepower and supply. The jump itself went as well as combat jumps ever did, which meant it was barely controlled chaos. The C-47s came in low to avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire, but low altitude meant less time for parachutes to deploy properly. Some men landed hard, spraining ankles and cracking ribs against the volcanic rock that jutted through the thin jungle soil. Others hung in the canopy 60 feet above ground, cutting themselves down and rappelling to earth with rope they carried for exactly this contingency. 3 men died in the jump when their parachutes malfunctioned. Another drowned in a sinkhole concealed beneath vines and rotting vegetation. But within 2 hours of the first parachute opening, the 82nd had assembled more than 80% of its combat strength and begun moving toward its primary objectives: the high ground overlooking the American perimeter and the Japanese supply routes running through the interior valleys. Lieutenant Tanaka and his fellow observers watched this assembly process with growing unease. The scattered paratroopers coalesced with disturbing speed, forming defensive perimeters and moving out in organized squads. They navigated the jungle with confidence despite being newcomers to this specific terrain. Most troubling, They appeared to have established radio communications with their command elements, coordinating their movements rather than blundering forward in isolated groups. Tanaka sent a runner back to regimental headquarters with his observations and a recommendation: hit them hard and hit them immediately before they consolidated their positions. The response came back within the hour. The regiment would attack at dawn the following day. It would be enough time, the colonel assured them. The Americans were isolated. They had only what they carried on their backs. Cut them off for a week, and they would wither like rice plants without water. What the Japanese regimental commander failed to understand was that these paratroopers had trained extensively for exactly this scenario: isolation, encirclement, and sustained combat without external support. The doctrine emphasized aggressive patrolling, rapid entrenchment, and mutual support between squads. More critically, those 85 pounds of gear each man carried represented a fundamentally different logistics philosophy than the Japanese employed. Imperial Army doctrine expected soldiers to endure hardship as a demonstration of spiritual strength. Reduced rations and limited ammunition were not logistical failures, but opportunities to prove devotion to the emperor and commitment to victory through will alone. The Americans, by contrast, approached warfare as an engineering problem. You needed X amount of food to maintain combat effectiveness. You needed Y rounds of ammunition to sustain Z hours of engagement. You planned accordingly, and you carried accordingly. This materialist approach, so often derided by Japanese propagandists as evidence of spiritual weakness, would prove devastatingly effective in the days ahead. The first Japanese attack came on January 18, just after dawn as promised. 3 companies of infantry, approximately 500 men, advanced through the jungle toward the 82nd's defensive positions on Hill 700, a volcanic outcropping that offered commanding views of the surrounding valleys. The Japanese came with rifles, light machine guns, and the absolute conviction that close combat and superior fighting spirit would overwhelm the American positions. They expected panic and retreat. What they encountered instead was a carefully orchestrated killing field. The paratroopers had spent the night digging fighting positions, establishing interlocking fields of fire, and pre-sighting their weapons on likely avenues of approach. They had trip wires connected to flares. They had Browning automatic rifles positioned to create crossfire zones. They had artillery coordinates plotted and radio communications established with their command post. When the Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line, they walked into a wall of firepower so intense it shattered the assault in minutes. The M1 Garand rifle, with its 8-round clip and semi-automatic action, allowed each American rifleman to deliver aimed fire at a rate 3 times faster than a Japanese soldier working a bolt-action Arisaka. The Browning automatic rifle, 1 per squad, provided suppressive fire equivalent to multiple riflemen. The .30 caliber machine guns fired 600 rounds per minute with a practical range exceeding 1,000 yards. The Japanese had encountered American firepower before, but never this concentrated, never this precise, and never delivered by men so thoroughly trained in its application. The attack collapsed. Bodies piled at the base of Hill 700. The survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and the confidence they had carried into battle. In his observation post, Lieutenant Tanaka recorded the engagement with shaking hands. The casualty estimates horrified him. More than 100 men killed or wounded in an assault lasting less than 30 minutes. The Americans had suffered, his scouts reported, perhaps a dozen casualties. The mathematics was impossible, obscene. How could 500 attacking soldiers, moving with the terrain and motivated by the warrior spirit, be stopped so decisively by perhaps 200 defenders? The answer lay in those 85 pounds of equipment and the industrial system that supplied it. Each American paratrooper on Hill 700 had expended, on average, 40 rounds of ammunition during the engagement. That represented roughly 1/5 of their combat load. They could fight 4 more battles of similar intensity before running dry, and they had only been on the ground for 36 hours. The Japanese mounted 4 more assaults over the following 3 days, each progressively more desperate and each meeting the same result. The 82nd held its positions not through suicidal determination or banzai counterattacks, but through disciplined fire, careful ammunition management, and tactical flexibility. When Japanese forces attempted infiltration at night, American patrols detected and eliminated them. When Japanese artillery began shelling Hill 700, the paratroopers called in counter-battery fire from American guns on the coastal perimeter. Fire directed with such accuracy, it silenced the Japanese batteries within hours. The symbolic object that came to represent this disparity, the thing that Japanese soldiers would later recall with a mixture of awe and bitterness, was the K-ration. The K-ration, that rectangular cardboard box of processed food, became the unexpected icon of American material superiority. Each box contained breakfast, lunch, or dinner, canned meat, crackers, a fruit bar, coffee or lemon powder, sugar tablets, and 4 cigarettes. 3 boxes provided approximately 2,900 calories, enough to sustain a soldier under moderate combat conditions. The packaging was waterproof. The food was nutritionally balanced. It tasted, by universal agreement, somewhere between bland and actively unpleasant. But it was food, reliable, consistent, and available in quantities that seemed limitless. On the 4th day of isolation, when Lieutenant Tanaka's own rations had dwindled to a handful of rice and a piece of dried fish, he watched through field glasses as American paratroopers ate their K-rations casually, some even discarding items they disliked. The gesture was unconscious, meaningless to the Americans themselves. To Tanaka, it represented everything the intelligence reports had missed. These men had so much they could afford to throw food away. They weren't conserving ammunition because they knew more was coming. They operated with the confidence of men backed by inexhaustible plenty. By January 22, the Japanese regimental commander faced an impossible situation. He had committed more than 2,000 men to reducing the American paratroop positions. He had suffered casualties approaching 40%. His supply lines were interdicted by American patrols. His ammunition stocks were critically low. And the paratroopers still held Hill 700 and the surrounding high ground, still called in devastating artillery strikes, and still showed no signs of collapse or withdrawal. The reports filtering back to division headquarters conveyed a growing sense of disbelief. How were these men, isolated and surrounded, fighting with the cohesion and firepower of a fully supported conventional unit? The answer, had anyone in the Japanese command structure been able to accept it, was that the Americans had effectively brought their supply line with them, carried on their backs and replenished by aerial resupply drops that began on January 23, the 7th day of isolation. The resupply operation itself demonstrated another dimension of American material superiority. While Japanese forces in comparable situations might have waited weeks for supply submarines or relied on pack horses to thread through jungle trails, the 82nd received airdrop supplies within a week of insertion. C-47 transports returned, circling over the secured drop zones while paratroopers marked the landing areas with colored smoke. Parachutes blossomed again, but this time they carried bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, fresh water, and more of those ubiquitous K-rations. Some bundles included mail from home, newspapers, and cartons of cigarettes. This psychological component of resupply proved almost as important as the material replenishment. The mail reminded these isolated soldiers that they remained connected to something larger, that home existed beyond the jungle and violence, that they fought as part of a society that remembered and cared about them individually. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, often went months without mail, and when letters did arrive, they contained increasingly desperate news from home about rationing, bombings, and shortages. On January 25, 9 days after the initial insertion, American forces broke through the perimeter and relieved the 82nd Airborne positions. By this point, the relief was almost superfluous. The paratroopers had not merely survived isolation, they had dominated it. They had inflicted casualties at a ratio exceeding 10 to 1. They had seized and held objectives. They had called in artillery and air strikes. They had maintained unit cohesion and combat effectiveness, without external support beyond that single aerial resupply. They had, in short, accomplished exactly what their doctrine promised and what Japanese intelligence had deemed impossible for American soldiers to achieve. Lieutenant Tanaka survived the battle, though his unit was reduced to less than company strength. In the months that followed, as he recovered from wounds sustained in a subsequent engagement, he would write a classified after-action report that circulated through Japanese military intelligence channels. The document made uncomfortable reading for senior officers. Tanaka described in precise detail the American tactical methods, their overwhelming firepower, their logistical sophistication, and most troubling, their evident individual initiative and adaptability. He noted that American NCOs made battlefield decisions that Japanese doctrine reserved for officers. He observed that American soldiers appeared motivated not by fear of punishment or devotion to hierarchy, but by horizontal loyalty to their fellow soldiers, and a kind of pragmatic professionalism that dispensed with ritual in favor of effectiveness. He concluded, in language carefully calibrated to avoid offending his superiors, that the Imperial Army's assessment of American military capability required fundamental revision. The report was filed, noted, and largely ignored. The institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Army was not designed to incorporate information that contradicted core ideological beliefs. To acknowledge that American soldiers might be equal or superior fighters was to challenge the premise of Japanese spiritual superiority that underpinned the entire war effort. To admit that material abundance translated directly into combat power was to confront an uncomfortable truth. Japan was being outproduced by a ratio approaching 20 to 1 in steel, 50 to 1 in oil production, and 100 to 1 in automotive manufacturing. These industrial disparities meant that for every tank Japan built, America built 20. For every aircraft Japan manufactured, America manufactured 10. And critically, America could afford to lose equipment while maintaining operational tempo. Japan could not. The K-rations thrown away casually by paratroopers on Hill 700 were not an aberration, but a symbol of an industrial system so productive it generated excess as a byproduct of normal operation. The transformation in Japanese perception of American paratroopers was not universal or immediate, but it was real. Frontline soldiers who encountered the 82nd and other airborne units in subsequent operations approached these engagements with notably different expectations. The laughter had stopped. In its place emerged a wary respect for enemies who seemed to carry their war-making capability with them, who fought with a combination of technological sophistication and individual courage that defied the stereotypes. Japanese tactical doctrine began to adapt, emphasizing immediate counterattacks against airborne insertions and concentration of force before the paratroopers could establish defensive positions. These adaptations acknowledged implicitly what Japanese high command would never formally admit. The Americans had fielded a genuinely elite infantry force that combined selection, training, equipment, and doctrine into a formidable combat capability. For the men of the 82nd Airborne themselves, Bougainville was not their bloodiest engagement or their most celebrated. Sicily had been larger. Market Garden would be more ambitious. The Bulge would be more desperate. But Bougainville crystallized what it meant to be an American paratrooper in the Pacific Theater, to operate independently in hostile terrain, to rely on training and cohesion rather than numerical superiority, to trust in equipment and logistics while maintaining individual initiative, and to endure isolation not through blind obedience but through horizontal loyalty and professional competence. The division's casualties for those 9 days totaled 37 killed and 112 wounded, a remarkably low figure for the intensity of combat and the tactical vulnerability of their position. That casualty ratio, approximately 1 American for every 15 Japanese, spoke volumes about the effectiveness of airborne doctrine when applied by properly trained and equipped soldiers. The K-ration, that despised cardboard box of processed food, became a running joke among the paratroopers themselves. Veterans would later recall trading them, complaining about them, and occasionally feeding them to stray dogs who seemed no more enthusiastic about the contents than the soldiers themselves. But in a broader sense, the K-ration and everything it represented, the industrial capacity to produce billions of units of standardized nutrition, the logistics network to distribute them globally, the material abundance that allowed soldiers to discard food rather than hoard it, embodied the American approach to warfare. The United States would not outfight enemies through superior warrior spirit or willingness to die. It would outproduce them, outshoot them, and outlast them. It would wage industrial warfare on a scale that made individual courage almost irrelevant, while simultaneously creating the conditions in which individual courage could flourish without being wasted on suicidal charges. The Japanese military never fully internalized these lessons. Tokyo's propagandists continued to emphasize spiritual strength over material capability. Training manuals continued to stress the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit. Operational planning continued to assume that American soldiers would collapse when separated from their supply lines and creature comforts. Each assumption proved costly. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese forces would fight with suicidal determination and tactical skill, inflicting heavy casualties, but ultimately succumbing to the same material disparity that had doomed the attacks on Hill 700. The kamikaze pilots who flew their aircraft into American ships operated on the assumption that spiritual devotion could overcome technological and numerical inferiority. The assumption was false. The ships kept coming. The supplies kept flowing. The industrial machine kept producing. And American soldiers, sailors, and Marines kept fighting with an effectiveness that derived not from Bushido or divine favor, but from training, equipment, and a social system that valued individual initiative within organizational discipline. The broader symbolism of Bougainville extended beyond tactical lessons. The 82nd Airborne's 9-day stand represented, in miniature, the essential dynamics of the Pacific War. An island nation with limited resources, operating at the end of extended supply lines, confronted a continental nation with vast industrial capacity and the logistical sophistication to project power globally. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill were not sufficient when the enemy could concentrate overwhelming firepower at the point of contact while sustaining minimal casualties through superior defensive doctrine. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side that could replace losses and sustain operational tempo indefinitely. Japan could not. America could. The outcome was never really in doubt once the industrial mobilization reached full capacity in 1943. Yet there remained something profoundly human in the way individual soldiers experienced these grand strategic realities. For the paratroopers on Hill 700, the 9 days were not an abstract demonstration of industrial superiority. They were long hours of terrified vigilance, sudden explosions of violence, the death of friends, the exhaustion of physical limits pushed beyond breaking. They were also moments of dark humor, small kindnesses, and the peculiar intimacy that develops among men who share mortal danger. The K-rations tasted terrible whether you understood their symbolic significance or not. The jungle was still miserable whether you conceptualized it as a theater of industrial warfare or simply as the place where you might die. The Japanese soldiers attacking uphill still had rifles that killed just as effectively as any American weapon, and they still had to be stopped with lead and blood and will. History remembers systems and outcomes. Soldiers remember fear and exhaustion and the weight of gear on their shoulders. Lieutenant Tanaka never saw combat again after recovering from his wounds. He was reassigned to a training unit in Japan, where he spent the final months of the war attempting to prepare teenage conscripts for battles they would never fight and an invasion that never came. In his private diary, entries from this period reflect a profound disillusionment. He wrote of the gap between propaganda and reality, between the warrior ideal and the industrial fact of modern warfare, between what young soldiers were told and what they would actually face. In one entry from July 1945, he described watching a training exercise where conscripts practiced banzai charges with bamboo spears. He noted that these boys, enthusiastic and brave, were being prepared to face an enemy that possessed flamethrowers, automatic weapons, artillery that could fire proximity-fused shells, and an industrial base that produced more ammunition in a week than Japan manufactured in a year. He did not write that the war was lost. Such words would have been treasonous and dangerous even in a private diary. But the implication suffused every line. The mathematics had always been impossible. The outcome had always been determined. The only variable was how much suffering would precede the inevitable conclusion. When news of the atomic bombings reached Tanaka's unit, his reaction was not shock, but a kind of grim recognition. Of course the Americans had such weapons. Of course they possessed the industrial sophistication and scientific capability to harness atomic energy for military purposes. It fit perfectly with everything he had observed on Bougainville, an enemy that approached warfare not as a test of spirit, but as an engineering problem to be solved through applied technology and overwhelming material resources. The bombs were simply K-rations expanded to strategic scale, an abundance so profound it could afford to waste entire cities to achieve military objectives. Tanaka surrendered with his unit on August 15, 1945. He returned to a devastated homeland and never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. The after-action report he had written about the American paratroopers was lost or destroyed in the chaos of Japan's collapse. The lessons it contained were learned and relearned at terrible cost throughout the Pacific Campaign. For the men of the 82nd Airborne, Bougainville became one more entry in the division's combat history, less famous than Market Garden, less symbolic than the Bulge, but significant to those who had been there. Veterans would occasionally gather for reunions, and someone would inevitably mention those 9 days, the Japanese attacks that kept coming, the ammunition that held out, and those goddamn K-rations. They would laugh about it, the way soldiers laugh about terrible things after enough time has passed. But beneath the humor lay a genuine pride. They had done what they were trained to do. They had held their ground. They had proven that American soldiers could fight with discipline and effectiveness even in the worst conditions, that the jokes about soft living and mechanical dependence were just jokes, and that when it mattered, when the situation was desperate and the odds were poor, they could match or exceed any enemy in the world. The legacy of Bougainville extended into the post-war development of American military doctrine. The success of airborne operations, despite their tactical complexity and vulnerability, validated the concept of vertical envelopment and rapid insertion forces. The Korean War would see continued use of paratroop operations. Vietnam would transform the concept into helicopter-borne air assault. The fundamental principle remained constant. Use technological advantage to achieve tactical surprise, concentrate force rapidly, and rely on superior firepower and logistics to sustain operations until relief or extraction. The doctrine was not universally successful. Market Garden's failure demonstrated the limits of airborne operations against prepared defenses, but it provided a template for combining technological innovation with traditional military virtues of courage and cohesion. The K-ration itself was eventually phased out, replaced by more palatable meal options like the C-ration and later the MRE. But the principle it embodied, that soldiers should carry their logistics with them as self-contained combat units, remained central to American military planning. Modern infantrymen carry equipment loads that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations, but they carry them for the same reason the 82nd Airborne carried 85 pounds into Bougainville. Because material abundance translates directly into combat power, because soldiers who eat regularly and shoot freely perform better than soldiers who don't, and because wars are ultimately won not by the side with the most fervent ideological commitment, but by the side that can sustain operations longer and concentrate power more effectively. There is a photograph that survives from Bougainville, taken on January 26, just after the relief force linked up with the 82nd's positions. It shows a group of paratroopers standing on Hill 700, rifles slung casually, smoking cigarettes and grinning at the camera. They look exhausted and dirty, their uniforms stained with mud and sweat, their faces unshaven and drawn. But they also look confident, even cocky, the attitude of men who have been tested and found themselves sufficient to the test. In the foreground of the photograph, barely visible, is a discarded K-ration box, the cardboard beginning to disintegrate in the tropical humidity. No one who saw the photograph at the time would have given that box a second glance. It was trash debris, the sort of thing that accumulated around combat positions. But in retrospect, it symbolized everything that had transpired on that volcanic hill. The abundance that allowed waste, the logistics that sustained independent operations, the industrial capacity that turned material superiority into tactical victory, and the democratic values that produced soldiers who could think independently while fighting cohesively. The Japanese soldiers who had laughed on January 17, watching parachutes bloom against the morning sky, had believed they understood what they were seeing. They saw scattered men, vulnerable and isolated, easy targets for coordinated attacks. What they failed to see were the invisible supply lines that followed those men through the air, the industrial base in Detroit and Pittsburgh, the training establishment at Fort Benning, the logistics network that could project power across 8,000 miles of ocean, and the political system that produced citizens willing to volunteer for hazardous duty not through compulsion or propaganda, but through their own choice and agency. These invisible elements were more significant than any weapon or piece of equipment. They represented the accumulated advantages of a free society with mass industrial capacity, advantages that became lethally apparent only when tested in combat. 9 days alone in the jungle, 9 days of attacks repulsed, of ammunition managed carefully but used freely when necessary, of K-rations eaten or discarded as appetite dictated, of mail from home and cigarettes shared between firefights, of American artillery called in with coordinates transmitted by radio to guns 30 miles away. 9 days that should have been impossible according to Japanese military theory and proved routine according to American military practice. 9 days that transformed laughter into respect and contempt into caution. 9 days that demonstrated, in miniature and in blood, the essential truth of the Pacific War. That material abundance combined with democratic resilience created a military force that could not be broken by spiritual fervor or tactical skill alone, and that the soldiers who embodied this combination, paratroopers descending from the sky with their pockets full of K-rations and their rifles full of ammunition, represented not weakness but a new kind of strength, one that would define warfare for generations to come. The silk parachutes that had seemed so fragile on January 17, so easily cut and so vulnerable in descent, had carried men who proved anything but fragile. They had carried the weight of an entire industrial civilization, condensed into those 85 pounds of gear, and the training that taught them how to use it. They had carried democracy to war, with all its messy individualism and pragmatic flexibility and fundamental respect for human life. And they had held for 9 days alone, not because they loved death, but because they were too professionally competent and too well-equipped to be broken by an enemy who expected spiritual strength to overcome material reality. The laughter had stopped. The lesson, bought with blood on a volcanic hillside in the Solomon Islands, echoed forward through the decades, that abundance is not weakness, that democracy is not fragility, and that soldiers who fight with full bellies and full ammunition pouches are not less formidable than those who glorify sacrifice. They are simply more likely to win. And in the end, in war as in history, that is the only metric that endures.